Good morning, everybody. This is the Men's Sunday School class here at Mercy Baptist Church. My name is Robert Rathbone, and we're going to be in the Ecclesiastes chapters 11 and 12. We'll cover all 10 verses in chapter 11, and then the first, I believe it's, first 8 verses in chapter 12. And in these two chapters, Solomon's going to point out that we don't know what the future holds. So basically we should conduct ourselves accordingly, that we need to, since we don't know what the future holds, what's going to happen, we need to take care of business while we still can, while we're young. And he's going to stress, especially when he gets into chapter 12, he's going to stress that while you're young, that's the time to do things, to take care of, working on investing for the future, while you still have energy, while you still have the strength and the motivation to do it. Because when you get older, the aches and pains, as your body ages, and as well as who knows what all sort of complications of life that come along and burden you and get in the way. So he's telling us, you need to get what you can done while you're young, while you still are able to do it. Because old age is coming, and followed by death. I guess that's about all I can say without actually getting into it. So let's go ahead and go to the Lord in prayer, and then we'll dig into it. Dear Heavenly Father, I want to thank you again for your love, your mercy, your grace, Lord, for dying on the cross to save us from our sins. And I pray, Father, Lord, that you would, as we go through these last two chapters of Ecclesiastes, Father, that you would endow us with the wisdom, Father, that's being expressed here, that you would help us to take it to heart and learn from it, and learn to put our trust in you, Lord, the one that holds the future. So all these things I ask in the precious name of Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, Ecclesiastes chapter 11, first verse, Solomon says, "Cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it. For thou shalt find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 and also to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth." All right, so Solomon appears to be giving us advice on investing in the future, of doing things now that will pay off later on in life. Because he says in that first verse, he says, "Cast thy bread upon the waters, and for thou shalt find it after many days." The Hebrew word there for bread, it means food or grain. And some commentators believe, or many commentators actually, believe that he's talking about taking grain and sowing it on marshy waters, marshy ground that's full of water. And he's saying, you like sow your seed now, because then after many days, or after it's had time to take root and grow, you'll find it again. It'll pay off. You'll get back from it what you put into it. And so his point, I guess you could take that in a more figurative sense, that whatever you do while you're young, you'll do things that you may not have immediate. It's kind of the opposite of instant gratification. You might not see the benefit of it immediately, but give it time. It'll pay off. That's like putting money in your 401k or whatever. You might not get that money back immediately, but later on, when you are retiring, you'll be glad that money that you did put that money back, put it in, invested it, and it grew, and now you have something to retire on. And so, be it sowing seed like a farmer does, he doesn't expect to go out like sow in the morning and then go out in the evening and say, oh, well, where's my crop? No, it comes later on. But he says after many days you'll find it. All right. Then he says, give a portion to 7 and also to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. The word there for evil, it's not evil in the moral sense. It's evil as in something bad happens, a negative circumstances. The Hebrew word means bad, displeasing, or sad. It's if something comes up, fire or accident or whatever. Something happens that's bad, and so Solomon says, give your portion to 8 or to 7 and also to 8. Because you don't know when something bad is going to happen. The idea here is also kind of related to investing. I think in financial circles they talk about diversification, where you don't invest all your money in one stock. You put some of it here, some of it there, some of it there, and the idea is this one over here might fail, but you've still got all these others, so you haven't lost all your money. And that's what Solomon's talking about. He says, look, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Spread it around. If you're a farmer, don't just plant maybe wheat. Plant corn, plant beans, plant or invest in having a herd of sheep or goats or cattle. A herd of cattle. I mean, it's like spread it out. So if one thing fails, you've got the others to keep you up, to support you. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. So he says, give a portion to 7, also 8, because you don't know. He said it might be none of these things fail. Could be half of them fail, but it's very, very unlikely that all of them are going to fail. So he's saying, spread your investments or your efforts into other things besides, don't put all your weight on one thing, because if it fails, then you're out of luck. But spread it around. All right, verse 3, he says, if the clouds be full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if the tree fall toward the south or toward the north, in the place where the tree falleth, he says, there it shall be. So now he's pointing out that we're powerless to control everything that happens in the future. I mean, there are some things we can influence, that we can control, that we can avoid problems. In fact, back in Hebrew, Proverbs, we saw where Solomon advocated. He said the wise, I'm paraphrasing him. He said basically the wise they see the problems or the dangers or whatever, and they avoid them. They take steps to avoid the problems, but the fool just goes straight on ahead and falls into these problems. But here he's saying, you can't avoid everything. There's some things that we're just powerless to change. And so he says, if the clouds be full of rain, he says, they're going to empty themselves upon the earth. That's just a fact of life. There's nothing you can do about it. Now, granted, in these, Solomon is speaking from a time period when they didn't have machinery, they didn't have technology to change these things. We sort of have that ability now to influence the weather to a certain extent. But in Solomon's day, if it was going to rain, it's going to rain. You couldn't make it rain, you couldn't stop it from raining. So he says, look, if the clouds be full of rain, then they empty themselves on the earth. Then he says, if a tree falls toward the north, or if a tree falls toward the south or toward the north, he says, in the place where the tree falleth, there it shall be. He says, you can't, when a tree starts falling, you can't control where it goes. You can't stop it from falling, and you can't change its direction as to where it's going to fall. And so he says, there's just like in life, where there's some things you can control, and then there's other things you have no control over. It's just going to happen. The way the Lord wants it to happen, that's the way it's going to happen. It's just out of your control. Then he says, verse 4, he says, he that observeth the wind shall not sow, and he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap. Now he's picturing a farmer maybe that's, he's afraid to sow his field because he's looking at the clouds and say, oh, well, it might rain or it might do this, or a storm's coming up. It's going to, ruin my seed or whatever. And he says, he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap. He's saying, because that you can't control everything and you can't predict how things are going to turn out. He said if you fixate on what the weather's doing, if a farmer fixates on what the weather's doing, he may never sow. And if he doesn't sow, he's not going to reap, because he's waiting for that perfect time to sow his seed. And so, as far as we're concerned, or the lesson to us is, we may never see the perfect time to do certain things, to get married, or the perfect time to buy a house or to buy a car, or whatever. And so he's saying, don't let that scare you away from doing these things that you need to do. But if you're waiting for that perfect time to do it, then at that time you may never do it, because you don't know what's going to happen. All right, let's see, verse 5. He says, as thou knowest not what is in the way. As thou knowest not is the way of the Spirit, nor how the bones do grow in the womb of her that is with child, even so thou knowest not the works of God, who maketh all. All right, so he's explaining, how limited our knowledge is, particularly in our knowledge of the way, what God's doing, how he does it, why he does it. So he says, as thou knowest not what is in the way of the Spirit. The word Spirit there, the Hebrew word, it means wind, or it can mean breath. And that's why, like, a lot of times we refer to our, the human spirit. It's the life in us that we can breathe. Because if you're breathing, you're alive. If you're not breathing, you're dead. And so he could be either saying, you don't know, how the wind, where it comes from to get to you. You might know what the direction it's blowing when it's blowing against you, but you don't know where it came from, how it got to you, and then where it goes after it passes by you, because you can't see it. Or he could be talking about spirit as in the life that's in a baby, that's like, as he says in the next thing, he says, nor how the bones do grow in the womb of her that is with child. He says that's just a mystery. We know a little more how God does it, because through medical science, how a baby grows from an embryo into a fetus, and then is finally born. But Solomon's he says, look, we don't know how bones grow in the womb, as a child. And he may be talking about this, not knowing the way of the Spirit. How does God get life into that baby, to give that baby life so that he can grow and then be born? And so he says, just like we don't understand these things, he says, even so thou knowest not the works of God, who maketh all. He says, look, God does things and we don't understand how he did it. We don't know why he did it. All we know is that he did do it, And so he's trying to, I guess, put us in our place, that realize, look, you don't know the future. All you can do is make wise choices best you can. But he says you don't know what the future holds. You don't know what God's doing and how he's doing it. Why is he doing it? And then verse 6, he says, in the morning sow thy seed, and at evening withhold not thine hand. For thou knowest not whether shall prosper, either this or that, or whether they both shall be alike good. All right, so now he's saying, kind of similar to the idea, don't put all your eggs in one basket. He says, when you do something, like sowing seed, for instance, he's using the illustration of sowing seed. he says, in the morning sow your seed, but then don't just assume that, that's all you have to do, that the seed's going to take root and grow and you'll have a crop. He says, in the morning sow your seed, in the evening withhold not thine hand. In other words, you need to continue working. Make sure, do everything you can to make sure that that seed succeeds in what you sowed it to do. And because he says, for thou knowest not whether shall prosper, either this or that. In other words, you've sown more in one field. He said, this field may do good. This one may fail and not produce much. And so he says, look, you don't know. Don't just sow your seed and assume it's going to work and everything will be great. He says, you need to not withhold your hand. Don't neglect it. Do what you need to do your best to make sure that it succeeds. Because he says, you don't know whether shall prosper. You don't know which one's going to prosper. He says, either this one or that one. He says, or I lost my place here. Or whether they both be alike good. In other words, they both may succeed. They could both fail. But he says you need to make sure you stay after things and make sure you give it every chance that you can to ensure that it's going to succeed. And that goes beyond the farmer scenario. And whatever you're doing in life, give it your best and don't neglect it. Don't assume that, well, I did this. It's, I put in the application that everything will work out. You need to stay after it and make sure, do your best to make sure that it's going to succeed, whatever it is you're doing. All right, verse 7, he says, truly the light is sweet, and a pleasant thing it is for the eyes to behold the sun. But if a man live many years and rejoice in them all, he says, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they shall be many. All that cometh is vanity. All right, so now he's talking about, he says, truly the light is sweet and the pleasant thing for the eyes to behold the sun. He seems to be talking about like the good days of life when things are going great. There's you have no problems. Or if they are, they're very minor. But he said, things are going good for you. He says that light is sweet, and it's a pleasant things for the eyes to behold the sun, to be able to enjoy life because you're prospering and things are going good. And he says, but if a man live many years, rejoice in them all. He says, if God gives you a long life, and then enjoy the life that God has given you. Rejoice in the good days that he's given you. He says, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they shall be many. He says, you got to remember, though, you're going to have good days, but he says you're also going to have bad days. There's going to be bad days when terrible things happen. Your loved one dies, or they're sick, and their life is being threatened, or you can have a car accident or something. Everything's going good, and all of a sudden, everything is going horribly wrong. He says, remember these days of darkness. He says, for they shall be many. He said, it'd be one thing if there was just one once in a while, but he said, we know from, that's life, that we live in a fallen world, and there are going to be lots of bad days that are going to come along. And he says, all that cometh is vanity. The word vanity there means a vapor. And so, vapor is very brief. Vapor's there, and then, it evaporates and it's gone. So he may be saying here that, these days, whether they're good days or they're bad days, they're short because time is constantly, we always think about how life's too short. He said, well, these days are going to, everything that comes along, it's temporary. And so, keep that in mind. If God gives you a lot of years, he says, rejoice in those, appreciate what God's done. But he says, all that cometh is vanity. It's all these days, whether they're good days or bad days, they're like a vapor. They're going to be short, brief, and temporary. So verse 9, he says, in light of that, he says, verse 9, rejoice, O man, in thy youth, and let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth, and walk in the ways of thine heart, and in the sight of thine eyes. But know thou that all these things God will bring thee in, that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment. All right, so he's saying, rejoice, O man, in thy youth. Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth. Knowing that life's short. He's encouraging the young man. He says, rejoice in your youth. Be happy while you're young. Utilize your youth, the energy you have, and to enjoy your life. He says, let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth. While you have energy and the ambition to do things while you're young, he says, take advantage of that. Do what you need to do. And he says, and walk in the ways of thine heart and in the sight of thine eyes. Now, I don't think, it seems like one of the popular ideas today is, you should follow your heart. Well, the Bible says the heart's deceitfully wicked above all things. Who can know it? So to just follow your heart is a recipe for disaster, because we have sinful hearts, and just doing what we want to do can send us into going down the wrong path. But here he says, walk in the ways of thine heart and in the sight of thine eyes. I think he's saying, do the things while you're motivated to do things. Like I want to go build myself a house. I want to work until I can afford to buy a farm or a field or land, and investing in the future, as it were. He says, walk in the ways of thine heart and the sight of thine eyes. Whatever you see that you can do, he says, do those things. Utilize, your energy and everything to do these things while you're young. He says, but know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment. He says, while you're doing these things, and this puts a governor on it, or a limit on it, the condition on it, he says, know thou that God, for all these things, God will bring thee into judgment. He says, while you're doing all these things, these ambitious things and such, he says, remember, God is watching. You are accountable to God. And so you need to govern your behavior and make sure you're not doing something that would be disobedient to God. So you can't just follow your heart. You need to. It has to be within the bounds of what God allows. And so verse 10, he says, therefore remove sorrow from thine heart, and put away evil from thy flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity. The word sorrow there, the Hebrew word, means grief or agitation, or it can mean anger. And the evil, of course, it can mean injury, distress, or misery. And so he's saying, he's basically saying, enjoy your life. Try not to get, avoid the things. I guess the distress, the injuries, the miseries, the physical miseries of life. Rejoice in the fact that you're young and you can do these things, because when you get older, as we'll see here in a few verses, you get older and you lose your energy, you lose your motivation. You can't do the things that you could have done at one time when you were young. And then he says, for childhood and youth are vanity. And of course the word vanity there means a vapor. It's brief, almost intangible. He's basically saying, childhood and youth are short. Do what you can while you're young, because you're going to get old. Every day you're getting a little bit older, and there'll be a point when you are no longer young, and you won't be able to do the things that you used to be able to do. So he says, you better enjoy your life while you can because you're getting old. Verse 12, he's kind of continuing the same idea. He says, remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. So he's saying, look, while you're young, you need to remember your Creator, serve God, and be faithful to Him. Because if you're not doing that when you're young, you're probably not going to do it when you're old. Some people say, well, I'm going to sow my wild oats while I'm young, but then when I'm older, that's when I'll settle down and I'll serve God. Well, if you're not going to do it when you're young, you're probably not going to do it when you're old. So he says, remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth. And he says, while the evil days come not, and evil again means, the negative circumstances, when bad things happen. He says, nor the years draw nigh. He says, do it while you're young before the years drag on and suddenly you're old. And you don't know, how that happened. It's the years have snuck up on you. And then he says, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. In other words, when you get older, you can't enjoy life like you could when you was young because you don't have the same kind of energy. You don't have, you have aches and pains that you didn't have when you were younger. You don't snap back from, when you're young, you can go out and work all day and come home, and the next day you're ready to go again because you've recovered. A good night's sleep did wonders for you. But when you get older, sometimes a good hard day's work means it might take you a day or two to recover from that if you're not used to it. And so he says, when these are the years when you're going to say, I have no pleasure in them. I'm not enjoying life because I can't do what I could do because it hurts, or I don't have the energy, or I don't have the ambition. And then verse 2, and actually from these verses through at least through verse 6, he's kind of describing old age in figurative terms or very descriptive or pictorial terms here. He says, while the sun or the light or the moon or the stars be not darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain, in the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall bow themselves, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look out of the windows be darkened, and the doors shall be shut in the streets when the sound of the grinding is low, and he shall rise up in the voice of he shall rise up at the voice of the bird, and all the daughters of music shall be brought low. All right, looking at these verses, he's talking about the light or the moon or stars be not darkened. He said, when you're young, the sun shining, you can go, or the light of the moon or the stars are there, but he's talking about them being darkened in old age. And he says, nor the clouds return after the rain. Normally you think, well, the clouds come, it rains and they pass on by and now it's sunny again. Well, he's saying, I think it's sort of the idea of, you don't recover or snap back after, after exhaustion. He says the clouds, and the clouds don't return, or the clouds do return after the rain. In other words, it's rain instead of it becoming sunny. Well, there's still more clouds there. It's the skies are still darkened because of the clouds. And he says, in the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the keepers of the house are the guards who would guard the house. And he says, but they tremble. Why are they trembling? Because they're old, and they can't stand steady. They don't have the strength that they used to have. It says, and the strong men shall bow themselves. In other words, they can't stand up straight because they are old and stooped over. he says, and the grinders shall cease because they are few. I think commentators believe they were talking about grinders of wheat into flour. And he says they are few because, they're getting old. They don't do it, so they don't grind the wheat anymore, or they're dying off. And he says, and those that look out the windows be darkened. In other words, they look out the windows, but they can't see anything because they can't see very well because their eyes, their vision is being darkened. It's their eyesight is deteriorating from age. And it says, and the doors be shut in the streets. I think commentators believe it's talking about like their mouths are shut. And so they get out in the streets and they're not talking to people. They don't talk like they used to. They don't converse with other people. Let me find my place again. And he says, and the sound of grinding is low. It's due to the lack of teeth, the grinding of the teeth in chewing their food. Because they don't have the teeth that they used to have. And then he says, and he shall rise up at the voice of the bird. When you're older, sometimes you have trouble sleeping. And so he says, he riseth up at the sound of a bird. Even a bird chirping wakes him up, and he can't sleep because of the bird chirping. And then it says, and the daughters of music shall be brought low. In other words, he doesn't enjoy music like he once did. Verse 5, he says, and when they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fear shall be in the way, and the almond tree shall flourish, and the grasshopper shall be a burden, and desire shall fail, because man goeth to his long home, and mourners go about also go about the streets. All right, so he says, when they shall be afraid of that which is high. In other words, he's afraid of heights now. I know I'm more afraid of heights now than I used to be when I was young. I could go climb up on a house and it didn't bother me, but now I get a little concerned that I might fall off. But he says they'll be afraid of that which is high, and it says fear shall be in the way. In other words, as when they go traveling from place to place, they become afraid of what somebody could rob them, or what might happen to them. That they could get hurt. Your fears as you get older, those types of fears increase. And it says, and the almond tree shall flourish. I think an almond tree, whenever it blooms, it's white. The blooms are white, and so commentators believe he's comparing that to the gray hair of old age. That the almond tree is a picture of having a head of gray hair. And he says, and a grasshopper shall be a burden. When you get older, even little things start annoying you that maybe didn't used to annoy you, and so the chirping of a grasshopper could be an annoyance. It could be a burden to you. And it says, and desire shall fail. That's referring to sexual desire. You get older and you don't have the sexual desire that you once had. And he says, because man goeth to his long home. His long home is his home that will be spending a long time in. And that's referring to the grave, where he's going to spend eternity. And so he's talking about man is going to die, and he says, and mourners go about in the streets. So these are those who are mourning over his death. Then verse 6, he says, or ever the silver cord be loosed, or the golden bowl be broken, or the pitcher be broken at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern. All right, so now these seem to be metaphors that Solomon is using, describing how your body begins to fail as you're approaching death. I think commentators believe that the silver cord is referring to your spinal column. The golden bowl may be referring to your head or your skull. And then he says, and the pitcher be broken at the fountain. Back then they go to the fountain and they use the pitcher to dip water out of. He says, if that's broken, you can't get water. And the wheel broken at the cistern, that's the wheel, we've all seen the wells where they have the wheel there and the rope going over it, and you let the bucket down into the well to get water out. And so he's basically saying these things, if these are broken, the pitcher or the wheel, then you're not going to be able to get water. And so it seems to be pictures of your body, like getting the water might be the circulatory system, but it's basically when you're getting old and your body is starting to fail from age, your body's wore out. Then verse 7, he says, Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. So he says the dust shall return to the earth as it was. In Genesis it tells us when God formed man of the dust of the earth, Genesis 3:19, he says, in the sweat of thy face thou shalt eat bread, and all till thou return unto the ground, for out of it thou wast taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. And I've heard it said multiple times that the human body, we're basically just a couple of dollars worth of chemicals. Without the life of God that God has given us, that's all we are. We're basically dust, because we're going to return to the grave, return to the ground. And so he says, then shall the dust return to the earth as it was. He says, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. And of course the word spirit there means breath or wind. It's basically the life that God gave us. He says when we die, our body's going to turn back into dust. Our spirit shall return unto God who gave it. In Genesis 2:7 it says, and the Lord formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. It was, until God breathed in the breath of life, all man was just a body of dust. But when God breathed into it, he became a living soul. It transformed. It gave life to this body that God had formed. And so Solomon's saying, this is the end of life. This is where life's going. It's all these things that he's talked about in your youth and then in your old age. And so he ends this, the part that the passage that our book has for us. He says, vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. He's saying it's not just, brief, like a man's life. We talk about life being too short, and I think that's what Solomon's saying. He says it's vanity of vanities. It's not just vanity, it's vanity of vanities. It's even among vanities, this is a vanity compared to the rest. And so he says it's all vanity. He says, life without God, without Jesus Christ, if you're just considering your life here on earth from beginning to end, he says it's brief and it's meaningless without God in that you're trusting in God for your eternal salvation. He says life is just meaningless without God. So, all right, that's our second bell. So that's our last lesson in Ecclesiastes. We'll be in Song of Solomon next week, and then after that we'll be going into the Gospel of Luke.